Now we come to the topic of the choice of the exchange rate regime and will describe the advantages and disadvantages of the different possibilities. First, what are the advantages and disadvantages of a free exchange rate system or a largely free exchange rate system? Well, first of all, of course, as we've already seen in the previous videos, it opens the possibility for sovereign monetary policy, even if there is free capital movement. Then it allows the exchange rate to be an adjustment mechanism in case of shocks. So if the exchange rate is fixed, it cannot act as a short-term adjustment mechanism. And speculative attacks on the currency would not occur in general. Could still occur so that there is a lot of downward pressure on the value of the currency to some extent, but it's much less prone to be affected by these speculative attacks. What are the disadvantages of a free exchange rate system? There is the possibility of high volatility because interest rate changes and expectation changes and so on, they would feed through to the exchange rate. So there could be high volatility, and this could make it more difficult for companies to forecast revenues and so on in other currencies. They would have to hedge against currency volatility. Transaction costs would be higher, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, the advantages and disadvantages of a fixed exchange rate system, or a rather fixed exchange rate system, mirror those of the free exchange rate system. So the advantages of a fixed exchange rate could be that it's easier to plan for companies. They don't need to forecast exchange rate volatility. It also means lower transaction costs because hedging is less important. And also a fixed exchange rate system may help to reduce inflationary pressures, at least if the peg is to a hard currency. The disadvantages are clear also from the discussion that we had in previous chapters. Monetary policy is not independent anymore, so that the central bank has to fix the interest rate to the requirements of the foreign country, basically, and this may not fit to the requirements of the home country's business cycle, basically. Then there are costs due to interventions on currency markets if you have to sell foreign reserves, and particularly these could be very high in case of fighting against speculative attacks, where it's quite often the case that after going through all the steps that countries can do or governments can do to cope with such a situation, in the end it nevertheless has to devalue the currency, but then it has already burned through international reserves and so on and so forth. So it could be quite costly. How should a country choose its exchange rate system? Generally, I think it can be said that in most circumstances, a free exchange rate seems to be the better choice. It allows more flexibility, it allows for sovereign monetary policy, it allows to keep capital flows open, and so on and so forth. However, there are certain exceptions to this. So the first situation is if a country needs to end an inflation crisis. In this case, it may be that in the past the country followed reckless monetary policy such that hyperinflation prevails, and in this case a peg to a hard currency would increase the credibility of the central bank. So if people believe this peg and that the central bank will follow this peg, inflation rates can come down very quickly, basically. And additionally, a peg can also end devaluations, by design, of course, and the devaluations often lead to more expensive imports and they could feed through to higher inflation again. So ending inflationary crisis can be done by the use of a peg to a hard currency. And the second situation is if there is an optimal currency union. So that's when countries have very integrated business cycles, so very similar business cycles that would not necessitate independent monetary policies. So there would be less need for independent monetary policies if the business cycles are very synchronized. Also, if there is high mobility of capital and labor, then this is a shock absorber. So if there is kind of recessionary tendencies in one country, then labor would move out, for example, and move to a booming area, and that would help because it would increase the wages in the area where people move out, and that could be such a shock absorber. Also, when there is a joint fiscal policy, then this could help to address differences across regions. So if there is a recessionary tendency again in one region, then the central government could invest in this region in terms of infrastructure payments, or have funds that are like the structural funds in the European Union that should help the low income areas basically. So if that all is in place, then it may be that the benefits of a joint currency would outweigh the drawbacks. So in this case, the drawback of not having independent monetary policy is small, and the benefits, saving transaction costs and kind of risks, exchange rate risks and so on, may be quite high. And close to that is, of course, the United States. So they are quite an optimal currency union. What about the euro area? That's definitely more problematic than in the US, and the reasons are that there is much less labor mobility across countries. Particularly, this may also be the case due to language barriers. There is no joint fiscal policy. I mean, there are some elements thereof, as I mentioned before, structural funds and so on. And there are more asymmetric business cycles and asymmetric shocks. So, and that's the reason why there are so many treaties and criteria that countries have to fulfill if they want to join the monetary union, so as to generate an optimal currency area kind of by force, right? So you impose convergence criteria, you impose certain things like the six-pack in the crisis times, and that may help to come closer to an optimal currency union. Another thing would be to have a stronger fiscal policy, joint fiscal policy, and the COVID-19 recovery fund, for example, goes in this direction, where the aim was also to help those regions that suffered most from COVID-19, which was particularly also Italy, that anyway struggled structurally because of the south of the country being comparatively poor. So overall, in a nutshell, I think it's fair to say that flexible, a floating currency is usually the best choice for a country, but there are some exceptions, and in this case, it may make sense to have a currency union or a peg to another currency. Thank you very much for watching the video. I hope you found it interesting and useful. For more economic content, please visit my channel that you see on the left hand side here, or follow one of the closely related videos that you see on the right hand side.